Let us pray. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, who art our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, as Helen said a few minutes ago, we finally come to the end. The last commandment at the end of our series of preaching about the commandments as we follow along with the Presbyterian Women's Study. It's hard to believe that we've been doing this all the way since the beginning of September. You might remember, because I think I've mentioned it a couple of times, that one of the ways that I've remembered the commandments is the way that we told them to the children who are part of the child care center, and the symbols that we used for the children with our fingers to help them remember the commandments. And so it always began when we sat down to talk to the children about the commandments with just holding up one finger. And immediately the children would all recognize that, and they would say, God's number one. And we say, right, that's right. God's number one. It means to worship the Lord your God and God alone. And then we would start to go through the rest of the commandments and show them the other finger motions. And to be honest, the children would sort of drop off at that point, and we'd have to explain over and over again what the different fingers meant in relationship to the commandments. And to be honest, I've forgotten most of them myself up to this point, until you get to the last commandment. And when you get to the last commandment, do not covet, we'd say to the children, okay, everybody, hold up all your fingers, all 10 fingers. And with all 10 fingers, go like this. Gimme, 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 gimme. And all the kids immediately would hold up their fingers and go, gimme, gimme, gimme. And that would come right back to their memory as clear as a bell. So in between, it was a little difficult to remember the commandments, but beginning with number one, God's number one, all the way to the end of gimme, 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 thou shalt not covet. Something about those physical actions with your fingers and how they related to the specific commandment really lodged in their memories, lodged in my memory as well. They could deeply understand, even as small children, what that meant when they were going with their hands and saying, gimme, gimme, gimme. They had an awareness of the significance of not trying to take from others what didn't belong to them, but belonged to somebody else. Maybe it was just that physical expression of taking something with your hands and taking it away from another person. We know as we begin to explore the meaning of this commandment, thou shalt not covet, that the verb for covet really means desire. And as you begin to look at it and explore the significance of this commandment, as it's referred to and addressed throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, that it has something to do as much with one's interior feelings as it has to do also with external actions. It has to do with this relationship between inordinate desire for something that doesn't belong to you but belongs to another person, to your neighbor, and your inability to control that desire until it gets to the point where it just consumes you, and you can find yourself thinking about and wanting to do nothing else than to get the possession that belongs to somebody else. And the commandment really addresses in a very broad and big way how that inordinate desire doesn't just harm and injure the neighbor. It isn't just a matter of economic goods or possessions and taking away from somebody what they already have, but it has something to do deeply with the way that inordinate desire destroys you as a person, and the way in which your actions then eventually also destroy your neighbor. They tend to do away with the presence of the reality of the neighbor, him or herself, until you've taken control of everything that the neighbor has. One scholar suggests we can see this even in the creation story, when Adam and Eve are given instructions about all the wonderful things within the Garden of Eden that are good and to be desired and to be enjoyed within the context of God's guidance, of God's instructions about what should not be taken and what should not be desired inordinately. But that's a difficult thing for Adam and Eve to resist. And it comes to the point in the story where their desire gets out of control. And then as they act on it, it changes the human way in the world through the rest of history. This commandment is about so much more than just seeing another thing and deciding you want it for yourself. It's really about understanding who God is and who God creates you to be and who God creates you to be in relationship with another person. In some ways, the first commandment and the last commandment embody everything that goes in between. The worship of God and the acknowledgement of God as our Creator, the understanding of God providing and giving to us, all the way to the understanding of our relationship with our neighbor and the importance of safeguarding that relationship and not becoming somebody who treats the neighbor as another thing which can eventually just be taken for our own desire. And all of life somehow falls in between those two commandments, following the other commandments and the other instructions as they've been given to us. I know in one of our Sunday school classes, we've been talking about an interview that the radio host Krista Tippett had with the Benedictine monk David Stendhal Rost, and what he had to say about the nature of our lives of gratitude as an important way of understanding and being who God has created us to be. And it seems to me that what he says about our lives of gratitude in many ways sum up with the life that the commandments present us with. Stendhal Ross talks about gratitude really as a process that begins with an experience and awareness of joy beginning to fill up within us until it comes to the point of that joy having to come to some kind of expression. We find ourselves needing to articulate it, to say something about it, so that we find ourselves saying thank you to somebody. And he calls that moving from joy to gratefulness. It's an important and natural and inevitable process. And that whole experience of knowing joy within you that comes up and overflows until it incorporates and envelops those whom you are in relationship with, those you find yourself living with, and expressions of gratitude and thankfulness. That whole experience he describes as the process of gratitude. And then he uses the image of a fountain, and he talks about our lives being like the bowl of a fountain that begin to collect water. And like joy rising up within us, the water begins to rise up in the fountain until it comes to the point where it overflows the fountain. And as it overflows, it begins to make noise, it begins to sprinkle and sparkle and spread, and an effervescence starts to take place until life itself begins to change as the fountain overflows. And he thinks this is really what gratitude does for us in our lives. But the problem, he says, is just at the point where our lives as like a fountain bowl begin to fill up, something comes along, an advertisement comes along and says, wait a minute, you know there's a better model, there's a newer model, there's a larger bowl of a fountain that you could have. In fact, your neighbor has a bigger bowl than you do. Your neighbor has a bigger fountain than you do. And so then we immediately want to enlarge what we have until it gets bigger and bigger, and it never eventually overflows, and we kill the process of gratitude and thanksgiving in our lives, and we never experience the joy itself, and we never experience the gift of sharing that with others because we're so easily grasped by this idea that there's something bigger or something better that somebody else has, and we have to have that for ourselves as well. And when we kill the process of joy becoming gratitude within us, we not only injure ourselves, but in some way we deeply injure our neighbor as well and our relationship within them. Certainly this idea of coveting and of wanting and of desiring is something that seems to be very, very prevalent, perhaps even emphasized during this time that we find ourselves in during this pandemic. You know as well as I do this feeling of all of a sudden not being able to have something that we're so used to and familiar with and now so greatly desire. At first it was toilet paper, wasn't it? And we began to covet toilet paper. Imagine that, but maybe we've moved beyond that to a higher order of things perhaps, and now we begin to have this deep desire and longing for relationship and connection, and we may even find ourselves coveting or wondering and why those people get to do that and I'm still doing this, and is it right that I have to endure this any longer when others seem to be able to be moving beyond the boundaries that we find set and being encouraged. It's a difficult time, isn't it? A time when we feel caught in this tension of desiring, of wanting many things which are good and wonderful, to be in relationship, to be in connection, to be in joyful conversation with each other. But we also know and find that in tension with the reality of needing to seek the well-being of all, the public health of all. It's a difficult spot to find ourselves in. And it's important to remember that this commandment, as all the commandments do, seek to give us guidance and seek to give us instruction about how we can be the kind of people that God intends for us to be, and how we can live the kind of lives that are lived for the well-being of all and not just for ourselves, because then we'll be able to begin to understand truly what it is for God to be our God, and for our lives not to be captured by other gods, especially the gods that we want to be able to control and hold on to for ourselves. Some of you may be familiar with the writings of Wendell Berry and some of his novels which take place in the town of Port Royal in Kentucky. One of the novels that he's written that I've found deeply meaningful is a novel, Jayber Crow. And it's a story about a man, Jayber Crow, who's a bit of a loner and moves through different areas until he settles down in Port Royal and becomes a barber there. He's an interesting person. He's a bit of a loner, a bachelor, but he makes friends within the community, deep friendships, and he observes other people and their lives, and he thinks out loud about the nature of all their lives together. And one of the persons in this particular novel that he observes is a young man named Troy Chatham. Troy Chatham is the local high school baseball standout star in his day and time, but he's graduated from high school and moved on from that, and yet he hasn't really moved on from that, and he seems to be stuck in trying to live out the glory days and think of himself and understand himself in terms of what that one brief moment of being a shining star was like for him. And Jayber Crow begins to observe how that becomes a very corrupting and distorting and destructive process, not just for Troy, but for the people that he begins to be in relationship with, one of whom is a very dear and important person to Jayber Crow, a young woman named Maddie. Troy marries Maddie, and he's still living as though he's the glory boy of the neighborhood and of the high school days, and he can't really handle the requirements and the obligations that come along with being married and starting a family and trying to work a farm and carry out the well-being that has to take place on the farm. Wendell Berry writes in this novel, as he's thinking about Jayber Crow observing Troy, he writes about the way that Troy loses sight of any other reference in life except himself and who he sees himself to be and who he wants to be, and the way that whatever he tried to do to be that always seemed to result in a diminishment of who he really was. Berry writes, as he describes Troy Chatham, he enlarged his pride by investing it in farm equipment. And so the equipment and the power to do things mechanically became his point of reference. His question was what his equipment could do, not what the farm could stand. And the farm, in a way, became his mirror. The farm never at any time was his reference point. It was only his mirror and his thinking about what he could do. And this was Troy's bewilderment, and it ultimately was his ruin as well. This was why Troy was reduced by everything he did to enlarge himself. It was why his life was all spending and no gain. It seems to me that this commandment against coveting is a guard against living that kind of life. The kind of life where everything we do to enlarge ourselves, every inordinate desire that pushes us to get more and more and take more and more from others, all of that just ends up reducing us. It becomes a life simply of always spending and never gaining. And it not only reduces us, it diminishes and eventually destroys the neighbor as well. Thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not forget that the Lord is your God, the Lord alone, and the Lord provides all that you need. This seems to be the heart of what we're reminded in the wonderful Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall lack for nothing. And then that psalm moves on, and each phrase, each verse becomes an exposition of the way that God provides for us throughout life all that we need. The Lord makes me to lie down in green pasture. The Lord leads me in the right paths, the paths of righteousness. The Lord prepares a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. The Lord is with me, even as I walk through the valley of shadow of death. Goodness and mercy and truth shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We couldn't ask for a better guide, a better assistant to follow with us and to walk with us and to lead us as we try and live out the commandments that we are given in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, the promise of God and the promise of Jesus that he will be our shepherd, our good shepherd, our good guide, who will show us all that God has given us, all that we need. We're reminded in John's passage that Jesus said, I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly. When we gather at the table to celebrate the Lord's Supper, to celebrate communion with the Ten Commandments in our mind and with the promises of Jesus to be our good shepherd in our ears, we know and we experience that this table is a place of abundant sufficiency for us, or it's a place of sufficient abundance. It's both and the same. We know here at the table the true reference point for our lives. We receive here at the table what will truly, indeed, enlarge us and give us all that we need to be who God desires us to be, not only for God and for ourselves, but for our neighbor as well. Here we're reminded of our heart's true desire to have and receive everything that God longs to give us. Over in the Struble Hall, where the children of the Child Care Center would normally be eating lunch on weekdays about 12 noon, their tables are set out there in the dining area right next to the kitchen. And it's been my experience many times to be walking back and forth at lunchtime as the kids are all gathered around the table, so delighted to see you walk by. They want to show you what they're having for lunch or this kind of thing. I usually try and stop and take a French fry, covet a French fry from one of the kids and take it from their plate or something else. It always causes a lot of emotion or commotion and a little disruption, but it's fun and enjoyable. But one of the things I've noticed is that sometimes when you're walking through at lunchtime, all the children will be at a table except for one or maybe two, and those children may have been having just a particularly difficult day, just a hard day following the teacher's instructions or the rules or things that they're supposed to do, and the teachers will just have to finally resort to asking and instructing and taking that particular child to sit at a table by themselves as they eat lunch, cut off and isolated from the other children. And if you've ever wanted to see a forlorn, sad expression, you should see the face of that one little child having to eat there by themselves. Great lamentation, great tears, great moaning and wailing going on from that spot. And it just tears your heart out when you walk by and you see the kid there. So often I'll try and go over and speak to that one off by themselves, and to no avail. They'll be crying so hard they can't even express what it is that's been going on. And then the teachers will usually cut their eye at me and say something, just leave them alone. You're doing more damage than you are doing good here. And so finally you continue to move on. When we gather at this table, the Good Shepherd collects all of us together. No matter what we've done, no matter the difficulty we find that we've had living within the guidelines for life that God has given us, when we gather at this table, the Good Shepherd gathers us all in together and holds us in his love and prays for us and pours his life out for us. When we gather at this table, we are reminded again, and we see again, and we touch again, and we take within ourselves again all that we know we need, and we can be content. We can be content. I was listening to an interview this week with Dr. Francis Collins. Dr. Francis Collins is the director of the National Institute for Health, and many years ago he led the project on mapping the genome and was highly recognized and awarded for the work that he did with that, and eventually became the director of the National Institute for Health. But Dr. Collins is also a devout Christian, and he's written much about his understanding of the relationship between science and faith and how those can go hand in hand, and how it's important to be a part of both of those for the well-being and flourishing of life. And so it's always fascinating. It was in this interview to hear Dr. Collins give so many appropriate and astute and informed answers about what's going on in the pandemic, but then also to hear him talk about his own faith and to hear how that was informing him and guiding him in the midst of this situation as well. And at the end of the interview, the interviewer asked him, Dr. Collins, what do you pray for at this time? And he took a deep breath and he said, I pray for so many things. I pray for the healthcare providers who are putting themselves in harm's way, and many who are now quarantined from their own families, and for the sacrificial way that they're giving themselves in their work at this time. I pray for those people. And he said, I pray for the families who have lost jobs and who are in severe economic distress. And I pray for the researchers, the people who are working so hard at the places like the National Institute of Health. He said, I've never seen people who are so dedicated and who are so fired up, and I'm worried about how hard they're working. I'm worried that they might burn out, and I pray for them. He said, I pray for the church. I pray for that in this time the people would be able to get the spiritual support and reassurance and nurture and guidance that they need from the church when the churches themselves are under such stress. I pray for the church. And then he said, I pray for myself. I pray that I would understand what's happening and I would be able to learn from it, and I would try to be strong and courageous and not grow weary. And then the interviewer said, Dr. Collins, I want to share with you an email that we've received by one of your former students, a student in medical school. Her name is Julia. She was one of your former students, but now she's a physician at Columbia Hospital in New York. And she sent in an email that says that she's been deployed to work overnight shifts in the IC triage unit there. And Julia writes, she wants you to know, Dr. Collins, she says that every time she crosses the bridge from her office into the hospital, she recites Psalm 121. I will lift my eyes to the hill. From whence will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. And Dr. Collins, Julia says to you, her former teacher, and to all who are listening, I'll be carrying the prayers of the BioLogos community as I go to work and carry the sweet aroma of Christ and the groans of the Holy Spirit to all the souls who are crying out in the epicenter of this pandemic. I will carry those prayers. Please carry me in yours. When we come to this table, the aroma of Christ and the groanings of the Holy Spirit carry us to receive what we need and to go and take to the world what they're longing for. Amen.